For those of you who don't know a lot, perhaps, about the East Michigan Conference, I have the privilege of serving as superintendent, and the East Michigan Conference represents a geographical area that goes from Lansing, Michigan, all the way to Port Huron, and then from Pontiac, Michigan, all the way up north to Wolverine. And there are this church, Blue Water, is affiliated with some 42 other congregations, and I have the honor of walking with pastors and serving these different bodies of believers and encouraging them on the journey. I want to take just a moment and just really sincerely thank you for the ways in recent weeks you have cared for and ministered to Pastor Randy and Judy and Rob and the children. I know that means so much to them. It means a lot to me, frankly, because knowing that you're a congregation that steps up and stands tall in the midst of obviously a challenging time says something about who you are as people of God. And so thank you for standing tall in the midst of it. For several weeks, I have been wandering with Moses and the people of Israel through the wilderness. Not personally, not fully there, but in terms of my reading and my devotional reflections, and so I want to sort of recapture the nature and the context of those years in the Old Testament biblical story, and then we'll turn toward the passage we're going to focus on. This morning I want to speak to you about the power of remembrance. A very important spiritual discipline as a Jesus follower in terms of your life and faith journey. So you may recall from early days in your faith journey, perhaps even a Sunday school class or even more recent times, the story of Moses and the burning bush. And so Moses has left behind Egypt, and really because of a little bit of chaos, that's an understatement, but certain levels of chaos in his life. He's out caring for a herd, and he's there, and he has this burning bush experience, and he has an encounter with an angel of the Lord. He recognizes this burning bush, and he says, boy, that's a little different. I think I'm going to go over and investigate that and get a better understanding of what's going on there. And as he goes, he encounters the Lord, and the Lord speaks to Moses and gives him a purpose and actually informs him, I'm going to send you back. And I'm going to use you to lead my people out of the bondage that they are in Egypt. And of course, Moses, perhaps like most of us would have done, I think, Moses kind of questions that. Like, Lord, are you sure you got this right? Because this is who I am. I'm not so sure I'm up to that task. Those moments where we get have a sense of the presence of the Lord, and in the presence of the Lord we find ourselves seeing what we are not, or what we might be lacking, and that's what Moses was experiencing. And so the Lord just does this really wonderful, loving thing that a good father does. The Lord says to him, well, pick up that staff. And so Moses picks up the staff and throws it down, and so God gives him this tool to show him, Moses, I'm going to be with you, and my power is going to be with you. He does another unique thing. He tells Moses to take his hand and to put it inside of his cloak. And when Moses pulls his hand out, it's full of leprosy. And then the next thing is we'll put it back in, and the Lord completely heals his hand. And I look at that and I see that as ways in which God uses adversity and difficulty in our lives to validate his presence with us. Scriptures tell us that the Lord promised to teach him and to equip him and give him the words that he would want to say. That's always been a very personal, meaningful passage to me, because when I was a young boy in 3rd grade, I had a phys ed teacher always calling me Marble Mouth. And you know, it's kind of cute, but you know, the truth of it is it really put certain ideas in my mind about what I was able to do when it came to standing in front of people and speaking. And so when the Lord called me to serve him, I remembered being Marble Mouth. And I, you know, if I was gut honest with you, I still think about it. And I might even trip a few times in front of you this morning. But I've learned that, you know, those are all ways in which God uses our weaknesses to glorify himself through us. And then there were the people that God promised to bring into. We're okay?
Yeah, the wind.
Oh, it's the windstorm. Okay, good. So it's just a windstorm, folks. So I was like, whoa. So, but God promised people in Moses' life, you know. And so I want you to think about, I want you to think about your journey. And I want you to think about the gifts or the blessings that God has given you, the tools, the ways that he has made his presence known in the midst of your adversity, the times where he's given you the words to say when you didn't have the words to say, or the ways that he's given you strength in the times of weakness, or people who shared the journey with you. Now let's turn to Deuteronomy chapter 8. And we're going to go down through this. And this is going to be sort of the baseline passage for us as we think about the importance, the power of remembrance. Deuteronomy chapter 8 verse 1 says, "Be careful to follow every command I am giving you today, so that you may live in increase and may enter and possess the land the Lord promised on oath to your ancestors." I want us to see that our pursuit of God and seeking to live according to his ways are so that we reach the future that he has promised for us. Not the future that maybe we have outlined, but the future that God has promised for us. And so we must be careful as we go about this journey and the choices that we make. Verse 2 says, "Remember," now here we go, "remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the wilderness these 40 years, to humble and test you in order to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep his commands." And so we're reminded here of this 40-year journey. We're reminded of God's ways of loving and how he cared for the people in some really profound and miraculous ways. We also see that the journey is as important as the destination. So the kinds of things that we encounter, the experiences that we have in life, God uses them to work in us, but also to reveal to us things about ourselves in light of who he is. The challenges we face in this life on the journey, they do humble us, don't they? And they test us. They reveal, perhaps most, our need for God. And that's a holy gift. Verse 3 says, "He humbled you, causing you to hunger, and then feeding you with manna, which neither you nor your ancestors had known, to teach you that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. Your clothes," verse 4 says, "your clothes did not wear out, your feet did not swell during these 40 years. Know then in your heart that as a man disciplines his son, so the Lord your God disciplines you. Now let's push pause for a moment. We know from the biblical story, God made his presence known to the people of Israel in really profound ways. Like there was the pillar of fire at night, and then the cloud by day. And so whenever the pillar of fire or the cloud moved, that was their understanding that that's when God wanted them to move with him. There was the times where there was no water and God provided water from a rock. That's a story right there, right? Times when they were hungry and God provided them food. And and the truth of it is, over the years that the Israelites were doing laps in the desert, over those years, there were some really good times. But, truth is there were some not so good times, and things didn't always go as planned. Didn't always go the way God wanted it to go, or certainly as the people of Israel wanted to go. And sometimes they got grumpy, and a little bit resistant and rebellious. You ever get grumpy? We'll have confession afterwards if you're saying no. I get grumpy. I do. That's my wife. My son Jordan's here. I get grumpy. They know it. But we see here in this scripture the reminder that God uses these things, the word discipline, God uses these things to shape us, to smooth the edges, to take sometimes what is a hard heart and give us a heart of flesh, right? God uses this. It's a miraculous process, transformational process. Now look further. It says, observe the commands of the Lord your God, walking in obedience to him, revering him. For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land with wheat and barley, vines and fig trees, pomegranates, olive oil and honey, a land where bread will not be scarce and you will lack nothing, a land where the rocks are iron and you can dig copper out of the hills. And so the story gives us a characterization of the promise, the future that God has for his people. And he calls on them, exhorts them, observe my commands. Remember to walk in my ways. Now look at verse 10. When you have eaten and are satisfied, praise the Lord your God for the good land he has given you. Now I want us to push pause for a moment. This is a critical discipline in our lives. Sometimes it's routine for us, right? When we have a meal, to just give thanks to the Lord. But sometimes it's a routine. We sort of lose sight of what it really means. Or when we gather here to worship with people of God, right? Perhaps more important than the new things we learn about God in worship is that we're reminded of the goodness of God and who he is, regardless of our circumstances, whether they be good, ugly, difficult, bad, however you might want to characterize them. Look at verse 11. It warns us, be careful that you do not forget the Lord your God, failing to observe his commands, his laws and decrees that I'm giving you this day. Goes on. Otherwise, here's the point. Otherwise, when you eat and are satisfied, when you build fine houses and settle down, and when your herds and flocks grow large, and your silver and gold increase, and all you have is multiplied, then your heart will become proud, and you'll forget the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. Now think about this. Isn't it true that pride can cause us to forget our need for God? It's true when we become self-reliant. It's true when we become self-focused. You see, in this story, right, the background of this is there were seasons and times when the people of Israel said, Moses, what are you doing? Where are you leading us? You're crazy, Moses. We should just go back to Egypt. I mean, there were seasons and times, so much so that they were rebellious, that a whole generation of people would pass and a new generation would be raised up. And so these words that are being spoken are actually being spoken to the new generation. So there's an understanding that the people of God had been resistant to the promises of God. And so Moses is bringing attention to these words. He says in verse 15, He led you through the vast and dreadful wilderness, that thirsty and waterless land, and its venomous snakes and scorpions. He brought you water out of the hard rock. He gave you manna, verse 16, to eat in the wilderness, something your ancestors had never known, to humble and test you so that in the end it may go well with you. Those words, humble and test, are repeated. Part of the nature of the faith journey is for us to embrace that reality. That there are things in life that will bless your life in this journey. But there are also things that will be absolutely humbling and testing to the very core of your being. And it's embracing that reality of a compassionate, loving God in the nature of life that we experience the power, the unimaginable love and power of God. The depth of love in those places is where we experience it. Verse 17 says, You may say to yourself, My power and the strength of my hands have produced this wealth for me. But remember, verse 18, remember the Lord your God, for it is He who gives you the ability to produce wealth and so confirms His covenant which He swore to your ancestors as it is today. Early in Deuteronomy, it gives these words in 4:9. I love these words. Be careful and watch yourselves so that you do not forget the things your eyes have seen or let them fade from your heart as long as you live. And teach them to your children and their children after them. What a powerful directive for our lives. So that's the biblical context. Now I want to share a bit out of my own story and my own faith journey, in hopes that you will be able to connect with your story in relationship to God. Think about when we have a tendency to forget. Certainly, times maybe when we're absolutely overwhelmed by the challenges and responsibilities that we have before us. Times where we just say, man, I'm going to try to figure this out without God because I don't think He's going to act fast enough. Right? There's times like that. There are times and seasons when it's so good, it's so, like, life is good, that we think, man, why would I need God? Why do I need God? It's just good. When our sense of need is low, we tend to forget. I know, as I think about this passage where it encourages us to remember and to not forget the things our eyes have seen and to not let them fade from your heart as long as you live. It's so important for us to reconnect to those early spaces in our lives, those early seasons where Jesus touched our hearts. So I want you to think about that. So myself, I grew up in a non-Christian home. My dad was a dairy farmer. My mom worked in the local juice factory. Later on, she worked in the light bulb factory. And she did that because farming was tough. In fact, over a 3-year period, ultimately my dad lost the farm because of a drought. But in my early life, I was born, I was the 4th of 4 sons. And my next oldest brother was 8 years older than me, so that ought to tell you something, right? I wasn't expecting, okay? And so one day my dad's caring for the farm, and my mom's working, and I'm a month old, and I'm in diapers. And so my dad goes up on the hill, grew up in a small town in western New York State, and he went looking for someone to care for his son. And so the people up on the hill said, well, we don't know a lot of people, but there's a woman up on that hill, and she cares for kids from time to time, so you might want to ask her. And they said to my dad, well, just know, though, she's a religious woman. And my dad said, well, I don't care if she's a religious woman. I need someone to watch my kids so I can care for the farm. So he took me up and to this woman's house. Her name was Blanche Brimmer, and she was this incredibly godly Christian woman. And she cared for me in the times that my mom and dad couldn't care for me, from the time I was a month old until 8 years old. And she prayed into my life. She shared God with my life. I didn't fully comprehend it all, but that's how God worked. And so years later in my adolescence, I really didn't seek after God. I didn't go to church, but I fell in love with the game of basketball. I began to play basketball and developed some skill there. And I had an assistant basketball coach, and he encouraged me. He says, you know, I know you're looking at a bunch of different schools. I encourage you to think about going to Roberts Wesleyan College. And so providentially, there was a lot of reasons why I wouldn't have gone to Roberts Wesleyan College. I did want to stay out of trouble. I wanted to get a good education, and I wanted to play basketball. So I played basketball, got a good education, didn't stay out of trouble. But God used that. And I gave my life to Jesus when I was a junior in college, and soon after that had a sense of the call of God on my life to follow Him, to serve the church, and to encourage others to follow Jesus. So it's important for me to think back and to see the providential ways and the hand of God on my life, even when I had no clue who God was. And I ask you this morning, what's your story? What's your story? What's your journey? How did God bring you to that place? Was it a mom or dad? Was it a grandparent? Was it a neighbor? Was it a coach? Was it a caregiver like I had that sowed seeds into your life and brought you to that place of knowing Jesus in a personal way? These are things that we must always remember and not allow ourselves to no longer see. It keeps us strong in the faith journey. There are other times when we experience God and it's not all good. There are challenges that we face. One particular time that comes to mind is my wife Eileen and I, we had two children, Stephen and Christina. And here's the truth. The truth of the story is my wife Eileen wanted 3 children. And I kind of looked at that and thought, well, you know, we got 2. They're 3 and 5. They're no longer attached at the hip. We actually can start having dinner from time to time. So I'm just telling you, for selfish reasons, I was like hesitant about having a 3rd child. And there was one other reason, I'll be honest with you. I was fearful of having a child that might be born with some challenges. I'm being honest. I'm not saying I was right. I'm just being honest with you. And so I wrestled with this. My wife Eileen grew up with 2 other sisters, and so she was really committed to the idea of having 3 children. And so I sought counsel from friends, and a brother said, you know, do you love your wife? I said, of course I love my wife. Well then, you know, honor her, you know, have another child. And so for whatever reason, through that conversation, the Lord really spoke to my heart, and I said, okay, we'll have a 3rd child. And so we did. And my youngest son, Jordan, is here with me this morning. He's 18. And but what you don't know is that when Jordan was born, his plumbing was all messed up. His esophagus was detached. He had grade 3 brain bleeds. This whole left upper side of his body had a vascular malformation. The truth is, for the first 3 years, we didn't know if he would ever walk or talk. And so here I was in the midst of this reality of life. But I have to tell you that the day he was born, I never thought 1 second about whether I wanted another child or not. It didn't matter. And those early days were rough. We had 13 surgeons and specialists. We were living most of our time at the Children's Hospital in Buffalo, New York. And I can tell you, I can remember the day I could actually take you to the New York State Thruway and the place where I was, where I gave over my son to the Lord. We had come to the end of ourselves. And on that same day, near that same hour, in a different place, my wife Eileen did that as well. And you know, it's an amazing story. God did some incredible miracles in Jordan's life, and today, you know, if you knew him well, you would know that you wouldn't know his story. You wouldn't believe his story was true. But I know the story, and it's something I must never forget. I want you to think about times in your life where the Lord demonstrated his miraculous power. You need to remember those times. It's important to your faith. It's important to where you are today. It's important to realizing the future that God has for you. There's one other time that I think of, and it was a time of loss. You know that there are seasons where things go well, and then there are times where we find ourselves wondering why. And I had one of those seasons. It was not long after our son Jordan was born. My brother Tim, who was 39 years of age, was battling leukemia, and he lost that battle. And that shoved me and our family sideways. You see, all my life, my dad had said to us boys, I never want to outlive one of my children. And parents understand that. It's a humbling, very sensitive reality. And so we lost him. And it sent our family into a spin. And we struggled for a period of time. But the people came around us and ministered to us. And I'll tell you a little bit more of the story. So one day we got a call to come to Davison, Michigan. And they asked me if I would consider moving to Davison, Michigan from Western New York to pastor the church there in Davison. And I said no. I said, you know, I didn't even know where Michigan was at the time. I'm sorry, don't be offended, but I didn't. I didn't know where Michigan was. And 3 weeks later, they called me again and felt like, you know, I probably ought to give this a little bit of consideration. So I got a map out, and I looked up, you know, and looked up the map and said, oh, there it is. And so we made our way, and through that process, we determined that yes, we would come. One day, while still getting ready to move from Western New York, my mom and dad pulled into our driveway. They lived about 2 hours away from us at the time. And my mom, she was so wound up and excited. As soon as she got out of the car, she says, we're going to sell everything and we're going to move with you. Wow, okay. So you know, I admit, so I didn't know how that was going to go, and they didn't go to church, and they weren't, you know, and what was that going to look like, and, you know, so they did. We moved, and 6 months later, they moved. They had 3 minivan fulls. They had gotten rid of, you know, at that point, 70 years of their stuff. I remember it was a crazy time. We had to help them go set up a bank account. And it had been 54 years since my mom had set up a bank account. She's like, I don't know how to do it anymore. And so we did all of that. And I can remember Sunday mornings, because I didn't know if they would come to church. And so I was pastoring this church. And see, the one thing that I was conscious of is they not only knew me after I was a Jesus follower, but they knew me before I was. Right? They knew my stuff, and here I am going to be their pastor? Like, that's really weird. And I remember pinching myself, because week after week, my mom and dad would walk through the door. And I'd say, man, I can't believe this. And, 6 months after that, we were doing a series of messages leading up to Easter, and we just continued to inform people. We wanted people to wrestle with their decision as it related to Jesus and how they were going to relate to him going forward, who he was going to be in their lives. And so we said to them, on Sunday morning, Easter Sunday, we're going to give an invitation, and we're just going to invite people to come forward and make a decision on that day. And so that Easter Sunday came, and I remember the day and the vivid image in my mind of seeing my mom and dad walk from the back of that church down to the aisle, tears in their face. A few weeks later, I had the opportunity to have them give their testimony before the congregation, and their grandchildren sitting on the floor and having the privilege of baptizing them. But I have to tell you, if you would have told me, well, Brad, you're going to start your faith journey and you're going to let your dad know that you feel called to the ministry and he's going to reject that in your life. And over the course of 17 years, you're going to go through some stuff you never imagined. And then along the way, you're going to lose your brother Tim. And you're going to move to Michigan. But I'm going to show myself to you in that journey. I'm going to make my presence known to you. You see, in my mind, only Hollywood can make up a story like that, but that's a true story. And today they live a couple miles from us, and we've enjoyed having them in our lives. So it's so important that we be careful and to watch ourselves so that we do not forget the things our eyes have seen or let them fade from our heart as long as we live. It's so important for what is happening now, today, and in the days to come. And so as we come to this close of our time together, Brother Brett's going to come and lead us in worship. By the way, that's a whole nother story. You have no idea. So 22 years ago, Brett Heinzman and I worked on the same ministry staff. And so it gives me goosebumps to have Brett lead worship and me to share this morning, because it just creates all kinds of flashbacks that only God could orchestrate. Right? How God weaves these things together. So let us remember that God can do immeasurably more. It's not always easy. We need God. Life reminds us of our need for him. We need one another. Life reminds us of our need for one another. So Brett, you lead us, and I just want to ask before you, what do you need to remember this morning? What do you need to recall from your own journey? Brett will lead us, and then I'll come and close this prayer.
Would you please